The rain fell steadily, tapping against the windows of St. Mary's Church like a melancholic melody. Inside, the air was heavy with sorrow, the kind that settles deep in your bones and refuses to leave. Rows of mourners sat quietly, their heads bowed, some clutching tissues while others stared blankly ahead. At the center of it all stood Margaret Carter, her slight frame draped in black, her face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. She hadn't eaten properly in days, and dark circles hung beneath her eyes like shadows of despair. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the rosary beads dangling from her fingers. Her son Ethan was gone, just 24 years old, full of life, laughter, and dreams yet unfulfilled. The thought of never hearing his voice again tore at her heart. It felt surreal, almost like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't a dream. It was harsh reality. Ethan had died in what the authorities called a tragic car accident on a lonely stretch of highway late one night. Yet despite the official explanation, something didn't sit right with Margaret. Something about the whole situation gnawed at her gut, refusing to let go. Ethan had always been a careful driver. Growing up, he'd listened intently whenever Margaret reminded him to buckle up or slow down during storms. Safety first, she used to say, and he'd roll his eyes playfully but follow her advice without fail. So why would he lose control now? And why did the police report mention skid marks leading off the road when Margaret knew Ethan wouldn't have panicked like that? These questions swirled in her mind endlessly, leaving her restless and uneasy. As the priest delivered the eulogy, his soft voice echoed through the church, speaking of Ethan's kindness, his humor, and the bright future he'd been robbed of. Friends and family nodded along, tears streaming down their faces. One by one, they stepped forward to share memories. How Ethan helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries. How he cracked jokes that could light up even the darkest room. How he dreamed of traveling the world someday. Margaret listened numbly, each word cutting deeper into her already shattered soul. But amidst the stories and shared grief, Margaret couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. There were gaps in the narrative, unanswered, questions that no one seemed willing to address. When the priest finally concluded the service, inviting everyone to pay their respects, Margaret lingered behind. As people filed out of the church, hugging her briefly before heading into the dreary afternoon, she remained rooted to the spot, staring at the closed coffin draped with white flowers. Her best friend, Sarah, approached her gently. "Margaret, you need to let him go," she whispered, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's time." Margaret shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "I can't," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain outside. "Not yet." Sarah sighed, understanding the depth of Margaret's pain but unsure how to help. "At least don't look inside," she pleaded softly. "Remember him as he was, happy, smiling, alive." But Margaret wasn't listening. Her thoughts were consumed by images of Ethan, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the way he hugged her tight every time he came home. She needed to see him one last time, not just to say goodbye, but to convince herself that this was real. Deep down, a part of her still hoped it was all some terrible misunderstanding, that Ethan would walk through the church doors any moment, apologizing for being late. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Margaret stepped toward the coffin. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. The mourners who remained grew silent, watching her with concern etched on their faces. Some tried to stop her, murmuring words of caution, but she ignored them. Her focus was singular, unwavering. Reaching the casket, she paused, her breath hitching as she placed her trembling hands on the lid. For a moment, she hesitated. What if Sarah was right? What if seeing him lying there, cold and still, broke her completely? But then she remembered the emptiness in her chest these past few days, the void that nothing could fill. If she walked away now, that emptiness might consume her entirely. Taking a deep breath, she began to lift the lid, her heart pounding so loudly she swore the entire church could hear it. Time seemed to slow as the lid creaked open, revealing what lay within. Or rather, what didn't. Because instead of finding Ethan resting peacefully inside, Margaret found only emptiness. A hollow space where her son should have been. Her breath caught in her throat, and her vision blurred as shock coursed through her veins. For a split second, she wondered if she was hallucinating, if grief had finally driven her mad. But then the gasps around her confirmed it. She wasn't imagining things. The coffin was empty. Murmurs erupted throughout the church, growing louder by the second. People exchanged bewildered glances, their faces pale with disbelief. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers under their breath, while others simply stared, too stunned to speak. Margaret staggered backward, her knees giving way beneath her. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her chest heaving as sobs racked her body. "Where is my son?" she choked out, her voice raw with anguish. "What have you done with him?" The undertaker rushed forward, his expression a mix of confusion and panic. "Ma'am, I swear to you, we placed him in the coffin this morning," he stammered, clearly shaken. "I don't know how this could have happened." But Margaret barely heard him. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them making sense. Was this some cruel prank? A mistake? Or was there something more sinister at play? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. Ethan's death was far from ordinary, and the truth was hiding somewhere in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The silence in the church was deafening, broken only by the sound of Margaret's sobs echoing through the cold stone walls. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the coffin, her knuckles white from the strain. The empty space inside stared back at her like a gaping wound, refusing to offer answers. Mourners whispered among themselves, their hushed voices blending with the steady patter of rain outside. Some crossed themselves nervously, while others took hesitant steps backward, unsure of what they had just witnessed. It was as though the air itself had shifted, thick with unease and disbelief. Margaret's mind raced, trying desperately to make sense of the impossible scene before her. How could Ethan's body simply vanish? She replayed the events of the past few days in her head, the phone call from the police, the visit to the morgue, the preparations for the funeral. Everything had seemed so routine, so final. Yet now, standing here, staring into an empty casket, none of it made sense anymore. A wave of nausea washed over her as she realized that this wasn't just a mistake or oversight. Something far more sinister was at play. Her best friend Sarah knelt beside her, gripping her arm tightly. "Margaret, you need to breathe," she urged, her voice trembling with concern. This doesn't mean anything. There has to be an explanation." But Margaret couldn't focus on explanations. Her thoughts were consumed by flashes of Ethan, his laughter, his smile, the way he always hugged her too tightly when he came home. He was real. He existed. And yet, here she was, faced with nothing but emptiness where his body should have been. The coffin wasn't just empty, it felt wrong, like a cruel mockery of everything she'd lost. Sarah tried again, her voice firmer this time. "Maybe someone moved him," she suggested. "A mix-up at the funeral home, perhaps? Or maybe there's another reason we don't know about yet." Margaret shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something isn't right. This isn't an accident." Her words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. The undertaker, who had been pacing nervously near the altar, finally approached them. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by visible distress, his hands wringing together as if trying to squeeze out answers. "Mrs. Carter, I swear to you, your son was placed in this coffin earlier today," he said, his voice shaking. "I supervised it myself. This shouldn't be happening." Margaret turned to him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of grief and anger. "Then explain it," she demanded, her voice rising despite her exhaustion. "Explain how my son disappears after you told me he was safe." The undertaker recoiled slightly, taken aback by her intensity. For a moment no one spoke. The mourners watched silently, their faces etched with shock and confusion. Some began to drift toward the exits, unable to bear the tension any longer. Others lingered, whispering theories under their breath. One elderly woman muttered something about divine intervention, while a younger man suggested it might be a practical joke gone horribly wrong. But none of their ideas brought Margaret any comfort. If anything, they only deepened her frustration. As the crowd thinned, Margaret found herself alone with Sarah and the undertaker. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand justice for her son. But she knew she couldn't do that without understanding what had happened first. Taking a shaky breath, she forced herself to think clearly, pushing aside the chaos swirling in her mind. "Tell me everything," she said, turning to the undertaker. Her voice was quieter now, but no less determined. "Start from the beginning. When did you last see Ethan?" The undertaker hesitated, glancing nervously at Sarah before meeting Margaret's gaze. "It was yesterday afternoon," he began, choosing his words carefully. "We received his body from the morgue late in the evening. Everything was documented, the transfer papers, the identification tags. We prepared him according to your wishes and placed him in the chapel overnight. This morning we moved him to the church for the service." "And who handled him?" Margaret asked sharply. "Who had access to the coffin?" The undertaker frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. "Only myself and 2 assistants," he admitted. "We're a small team, Mrs. Carter. I assure you we take our work very seriously. Nothing like this has ever happened before." Margaret studied him closely, searching for any sign of dishonesty, but his expression was genuine, his fear palpable. Whatever had happened, it seemed unlikely that he was directly responsible. Still, she couldn't ignore the possibility that someone else might have tampered with the coffin. Someone who didn't want Ethan's body to be seen. Sarah gently touched Margaret's shoulder, pulling her attention away from the undertaker. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, her brow furrowed with concern. Margaret hesitated, unsure of how much to say. The truth was she didn't trust anyone, not fully, not even the people standing in this room. Something about Ethan's death had felt off from the start, and now with the coffin empty, her suspicions had grown into full-blown alarm. "I think someone took him," she said finally, her voice low but resolute. "Someone who didn't want us to see him." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "You think foul play?" she whispered, glancing around nervously as if expecting someone to overhear. Margaret nodded grimly. "I don't know what else to believe. Why else would his body be missing? Why go through all this trouble unless they're hiding something?" "The deal." Undertaker cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mrs. Carter, I understand your concerns, but let's not jump to conclusions. Perhaps there's a logical explanation." "There is no logical explanation," Margaret snapped, cutting him off. Her voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't care. "My son is gone, his body is gone, and I'm not leaving until I find out why." With that, she stood up abruptly, brushing off Sarah's attempts to hold her back. Her legs felt weak, unsteady, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. She wouldn't let this rest, not until she uncovered the truth. Turning to the undertaker, she fixed him with a steely glare. "I want to see the records," she said, firmly. "Every document, every photo, every note related to Ethan right now." The undertaker hesitated, visibly torn between protocol and Margaret's unwavering determination. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "Very well," he said, gesturing for her to follow him. "Let's go to the office." As they left the church, the rain continued to fall, soaking the ground and casting a somber mood over the town. Margaret walked briskly, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Fear of what she might discover, and hope that somewhere, somehow, the truth would lead her to her son. The undertaker's office was small and dimly lit, the kind of space that felt more like a storage room than a place of business. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal surfaces dulled by years of use. A desk cluttered with papers sat in the center of the room, illuminated by the pale glow of a flickering fluorescent light overhead. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, adding to the sense of unease that had followed Margaret since she'd opened the coffin. Margaret stood rigidly in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if trying to hold herself together. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, searching for something, anything, that might explain what had happened to Ethan. The undertaker shuffled nervously behind her, pulling out folders and documents from one of the cabinets. He laid them on the desk with trembling hands, his movements hurried but deliberate. "Here are the records," he said, his voice unsteady. "Everything is documented, the transfer from the morgue, the preparation process, even the identification. Tags, you can see for yourself." Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding in her ears. She picked up the first folder and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. The handwriting was neat but impersonal, filled with technical terms and timestamps. There were photos, too. Grainy images of Ethan lying motionless on a gurney, his face partially obscured by a sheet. Seeing him like that made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to keep looking. Every detail mattered now. As she sifted through the documents, Sarah hovered nearby, her presence both comforting and tense. "Do you see anything unusual?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret shook her head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Not yet," she replied, her tone clipped. "But I'm not done." She moved on to the next folder, this one containing inventory logs and staff schedules. Names jumped out at her. People she didn't recognize. People who had handled Ethan's body after his death. One name caught her attention. Daniel Harper, listed as an assistant undertaker. She frowned, tapping the page with her finger. "Who's this?" she demanded, turning to the undertaker. He glanced at the name, his expression tightening slightly. "Daniel works part-time here," he explained cautiously. "He's been with us for about 6 months, reliable, quiet, never caused any trouble." Margaret's instincts flared. Quiet and reliable weren't necessarily bad traits, but they also weren't enough to ease her growing suspicion. "Was he involved in preparing Ethan?" she pressed. The undertaker hesitated, glancing down at the floor before nodding reluctantly. "Yes, he assisted me with the preparations yesterday afternoon." "Where is he now?" Margaret asked sharply, her voice rising. I don't know," the undertaker stammered. "He left early today, said he wasn't feeling well." Margaret's jaw tightened. Something about the timing felt wrong. Why would Daniel call in sick on the same day Ethan's body went missing? It was too convenient, too suspicious to ignore. Without another word, she grabbed the folder and shoved it into her bag. "We need to find him," she said firmly, already heading for the door. Sarah hurried after her, grabbing her arm to slow her down. "Margaret, wait. You can't just go chasing after someone without knowing what you're walking into. This could be dangerous." Margaret stopped abruptly, turning to face her friend. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, but there was fire in them, a determination that refused to be extinguished. "I don't care if it's dangerous," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "My son is missing. His body is gone. Someone took him, and I'm not going to sit around waiting for answers. If Daniel knows something, I'm going to find out what it is." Sarah sighed, clearly torn between supporting Margaret and protecting her. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "All right," she said. "But let me come with you. You shouldn't do this alone." Margaret hesitated, then gave a short nod of agreement. Having Sarah by her side might actually help, especially if things got complicated. Together, they left the office and climbed into Margaret's car, the rain still pouring down outside. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge as they drove toward Daniel Harper's address, which they had hastily scribbled down from the undertaker's records. The journey felt endless, each mile stretching longer than the last. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white against the dark leather. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. What if Daniel really was involved? What if he led them to whoever or whatever had taken Ethan? And what would she do when she finally confronted him? When they arrived at Daniel's apartment building, The scene was eerily quiet. The building looked run down, its paint peeling and windows cracked. A single street lamp flickered weakly in the distance, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Margaret parked the car and stepped out, her breath catching as the cold rain soaked through her coat. She glanced at Sarah, who looked equally uneasy, and together they approached the entrance. Inside, the hallway was dim and musty, the walls lined with faded posters advertising local events from years ago. They found Daniel's apartment on the second floor, its door slightly ajar. Margaret froze, her pulse quickening. "That's not right," she whispered, pointing to the gap in the doorframe. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with alarm. "Do you think we should knock? Or maybe call the police?" Before Margaret could answer, a low groan came from inside the apartment. It was faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain, but unmistakable. Without hesitation, Margaret pushed the door open further, stepping cautiously into the darkened room. The smell hit her first, sharp and metallic, like rust. Her stomach twisted as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, revealing a scene that made her blood run cold. Daniel lay sprawled on the floor, unconscious but alive. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, staining the carpet beneath him. Nearby, a chair had been overturned, and shards of broken glass littered the ground. But what caught Margaret's attention most was the crumpled piece of paper clutched in Daniel's hand. She knelt beside him, prying the note loose with trembling fingers. The writing was hurried and smudged, but legible enough to send a chill down her spine. "They're watching," it read. "Don't trust anyone." Margaret stared at the words, her mind reeling. Who were they? And why had someone attacked Daniel? Whatever was happening, it was bigger than she had imagined, and far more dangerous. As she turned to Sarah, her voice was barely audible over the storm outside. "We need to figure out who's behind this," she said, her resolve stronger than ever. "Because until we do, Ethan's story isn't over." Margaret's hands trembled as she held the crumpled note, its words etched into her mind like a warning carved in stone. "They're watching. Don't trust anyone." The room around her felt suffocating, the air thick with unanswered questions and mounting dread. Sarah knelt beside her, her face pale as she glanced nervously at Daniel's unconscious form. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the windows, each drop amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the air. "What does it mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Who are they?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of information: Ethan's mysterious death, the empty coffin, Daniel's attack, and now this cryptic message. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. Someone was hiding something, and they were willing to go to great lengths to keep it buried. For the first time since Ethan's passing, Margaret felt a spark of clarity amid her grief. This wasn't just about finding closure anymore. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. "We need to get him help," Margaret said finally, nodding toward Daniel. His breathing was shallow but steady, and though he appeared injured, he didn't seem to be in immediate danger. Still, leaving him here wasn't an option. Whoever had done this could return at any moment. Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone to call for an ambulance. As she spoke to the dispatcher, Margaret scanned the apartment for anything else that might shed light on what had happened. The place was small and sparsely furnished, with peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture. A cluttered desk in the corner caught her eye. Papers, folders, and a laptop lay scattered across its surface, as if someone had been searching for something, or trying to hide it. Her heart thudded in her chest as she approached the desk. She hesitated for a moment, then began rifling through the papers. Most of them were mundane: bills, receipts, old letters. But one folder stood out. Its label read, Project E, in bold black letters. Inside were documents detailing transactions, names and dates. At first glance, they seemed unrelated to Ethan, but as Margaret flipped through the pages, a name jumped out at her. Carter Enterprises, the company where Ethan had worked before his death. Her breath hitched. Could this be connected? Had Ethan stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to know? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She tucked the folder under her arm, determined to examine it more closely later. Just as she turned to leave, her gaze landed on the laptop. Its screen was cracked, but it was still powered on, displaying a login page. Without thinking twice, she grabbed it too, stuffing it into her bag. By the time Sarah finished her call, paramedics were already on their way. Together, they waited outside the building, huddled under the awning as the rain soaked everything around them. Neither spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts. When the ambulance arrived, Daniel was loaded onto a stretcher and whisked away, his fate uncertain. Margaret watched the vehicle disappear into the night, her resolve hardening with every passing second. The next morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the contents of the folder she'd taken from Daniel's apartment. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room, but it did little to lift the heaviness in her heart. Sarah sat across from her, sipping coffee, while occasionally glancing at her phone for updates on Daniel's condition. So far, there was no news. "This is insane," Sarah muttered, shaking her head as she flipped through the documents. "What even is all this? It looks like corporate stuff." "It's more than that," Margaret replied, her voice low, but firm. She tapped a sheet of paper covered in financial records. "Look at these transactions, large sums of money being transferred between accounts, and here," she pointed to another document, "this name keeps showing up, Reginald Hargrove. Ever heard of him?" Sarah frowned, scanning the page. "No, but it sounds familiar. Wait, isn't he some big shot around town? Owns half the businesses in the county or something?" Margaret nodded grimly. "Exactly. And guess who Carter Enterprises has been doing business with lately? Him." A cold realization settled over them. If Ethan had discovered something illegal involving Hargrove, a man known for his ruthless tactics, it would explain why someone wanted him silenced. But proving it wouldn't be easy. These documents were circumstantial at best, and without Ethan's testimony, connecting the dots would require more than luck. Determined to dig deeper, Margaret opened the laptop she'd brought home. After several failed attempts to bypass the password, she decided to take it to a tech-savvy friend named Marcus, who ran a small computer repair shop downtown. Marcus was skeptical when she explained the situation, but after seeing the urgency in her eyes, he agreed to help. Hours later, Marcus called her back with startling news. "There's encrypted data on this thing," he said, his tone serious. "Looks like someone tried to wipe it clean, but I managed to recover a few files. You're not going to believe this." He handed her a USB drive containing the recovered files. Back at home, Margaret plugged it into her computer and began scrolling through the contents. What she found made her blood run cold. Hidden among the corrupted files were emails exchanged between Ethan and an anonymous sender. In one email, Ethan wrote, "I know what you've been doing, and I have proof. If you don't stop, I'll go public. This ends now." Attached to the email was a file labeled Evidence Zip, but it was password protected. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing. Whoever Ethan had been threatening clearly hadn't backed down, and now he was dead. As days passed, Margaret became consumed by her investigation. She visited the morgue, demanding to speak with the coroner who had handled Ethan's case. To her surprise, he admitted that Ethan's injuries weren't consistent with a car accident. Bruising on his wrists suggested restraint, and traces of sedatives were found in his system. "We assumed it was part of the crash," the coroner said nervously. "But looking back, it doesn't add up." Margaret also reached out to Ethan's co-workers, subtly asking questions about his last days at Carter Enterprises. One colleague mentioned overhearing Ethan arguing with someone on the phone shortly before his death. "He sounded scared," the co-worker recalled, "like he knew he was in trouble." Every new piece of information brought Margaret closer to the truth, but it also painted a darker picture. Someone powerful and dangerous was involved, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close. Despite the risks, Margaret refused to back down. For Ethan, she would risk everything. One evening, as she sifted through the evidence spread across her dining table, Sarah looked at her with concern. You're playing with fire, Margaret, she said softly. These people. They won't stop until you're gone, too. Margaret met her gaze, her expression unyielding. Then let them try, she said, because I'm not giving up, not until I find justice for my son. Margaret's days blurred into a whirlwind of late nights, endless phone calls, and clandestine meetings. The evidence she had gathered so far painted a chilling picture. Ethan hadn't died in a random car accident. He had been targeted. Someone, powerful and dangerous, wanted him silenced, and they were willing to do whatever it took to cover their tracks. But the deeper Margaret dug, the more she realized that exposing the truth wasn't just about finding justice for her son. It was about survival. She knew she was stepping onto a battlefield where the stakes were life and death. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by documents, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Her heart raced as she answered cautiously. Hello? The voice on the other end was low and deliberate, almost mechanical. You've been asking too many questions, Mrs. Carter, the caller said. Stop now or you'll regret it. Her breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. Who is this? She demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. There was a pause followed by a cold chuckle. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you're playing a game you can't win. Leave it alone. Before Margaret could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone, her hands trembling. The threat was clear, and yet instead of scaring her into silence, it only fueled her determination. Whoever these people were, they were afraid enough to try intimidating her. That meant she was getting close. The next morning, Margaret decided to confront Reginald Hargrove directly. It was a risky move, but she felt she had no choice. If he was involved in Ethan's death, she needed to see his reaction face to face. Armed with copies of the financial records and emails linking him to Carter Enterprises, she drove to his sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. The mansion loomed ahead of her like a fortress, its towering gates and security cameras a stark reminder of the power Hargrove wielded. She parked outside the gate and walked up to the intercom, pressing the button firmly. A gruff voice crackled through the speaker. Can I help you? I'm here to speak with Mr. Hargrove, Margaret said, her tone resolute. It's urgent. There was a long pause before the gate slowly creaked open. As she approached the house, two burly men in suits appeared, flanking the entrance. They ushered her inside without a word, their eyes scanning her suspiciously. The opulence of the mansion hit her immediately: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with expensive artwork. Despite the grandeur, the atmosphere was suffocating, weighed down by an air of arrogance and control. Reginald Hargrove sat in a leather chair behind a massive mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. He was older than she expected, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Mrs. Carter, he said smoothly, gesturing for her to sit. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed the documents on his desk, spreading them out for him to see. I know about your dealings with Carter Enterprises, she said, her voice unwavering. And I know my son uncovered something you didn't want exposed. So tell me, Mr. Hargrove, why did you have him killed? Hargrove's lips curled into a sly smile, though his eyes remained cold. My dear woman, you're mistaken, he said, leaning back in his chair. I have no idea what you're talking about. You expect me to believe that? Margaret shot back, her anger bubbling to the surface. These transactions, these emails, they all point to you. My son threatened to expose you, and now he's dead. Don't insult my intelligence. For a moment, Hargrove's composure faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, but just as quickly, he regained control, his demeanor calm and calculated. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with your son's unfortunate passing, you'd better have proof, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Otherwise, you're treading very dangerous ground. Margaret clenched her fists under the table, resisting the urge to lunge across the desk. She knew he was right. She didn't have definitive proof, not yet. but she also knew she couldn't let him intimidate her. "I'll find the proof," she said, standing up. "And when I do, the whole world will know what kind of man you really are." Hargrove watched her leave, his expression unreadable. As she stepped outside, the weight of his gaze followed her, sending a chill down her spine. She had gambled by confronting him, and while she hadn't gotten the answers she wanted, one thing was certain: he was hiding something. Back home, Margaret pored over the evidence again, searching for anything she might have missed. Sarah joined her, bringing coffee and sandwiches, though neither of them ate much. "What if we go public?" Sarah suggested hesitantly. "Take everything to the media? Maybe someone else can piece it together." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. We need something concrete, a smoking gun that ties Hargrove directly to Ethan's death. Otherwise, he'll just deny everything and crush us." As she spoke, her eyes landed on the encrypted file Marcus had recovered from Ethan's laptop. The password-protected zip file labeled Evidence Zip still eluded her. Frustrated, she reached for her phone and dialed Ethan's closest friend, Jake, hoping he might remember something useful. Jake had always been tech-savvy and often helped Ethan with password issues. When Jake arrived later that evening, he examined the file intently. "Let me try a few things," he said, typing furiously on his laptop. After several tense minutes, he paused, his brow furrowed. "Ethan used birthdays and anniversaries as passwords sometimes. Any ideas?" Margaret thought for a moment, then whispered, "Try mine." She rattled off her birthday, holding her breath as Jake entered it. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the file unlocked. Inside were photos, documents, and audio recordings, all damning evidence implicating Hargrove in illegal activities. There were invoices for bribes, recordings of incriminating conversations, and even surveillance footage, showing Hargrove meeting with shadowy figures in secluded locations. Most shockingly, there was a time-stamped video of Ethan being dragged into a car by masked men. Margaret stared at the screen, tears streaming down her face. This was it, the proof she needed. But as relief washed over her, so did fear. Now that she had the evidence, she became a target. Hargrove wouldn't stop until the files were destroyed, and possibly her along with them. "We need to act fast," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We can't keep this to ourselves anymore." Margaret nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. "Tomorrow we take this to the authorities, and this time they won't be able to ignore it." But as she tucked the USB drive safely into her pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders, but there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about justice for Ethan anymore. It was about standing up against a man who thought he was untouchable. Hargrove had underestimated her, and that would be his downfall. Sarah arrived early, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and a determined look in her eyes. "Ready?" she asked, placing 1 cup in front of Margaret. Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the mug. "I've never been more ready," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But this isn't going to be easy. Hargrove has connections everywhere. If we make one wrong move, they'll bury us." "We won't let that happen," Sarah replied firmly. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever comes next, we face it side by side." With that, they gathered their things, the USB drive, printed copies of the evidence, and notes detailing everything Margaret had uncovered, and headed to the local police station. It was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street, its brick facade weathered from years of service. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. A young officer greeted them at the front desk, his expression polite but guarded. "We need to speak with someone in charge," Margaret said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's urgent." The officer hesitated, clearly sensing the gravity of her request. After a brief phone call, he led them to a conference room where Detective Laura Myers waited. Myers was middle-aged, with sharp features and an air of authority. That put Margaret at ease. She listened intently as Margaret laid out the case, presenting each piece of evidence methodically. The financial records, the emails, the surveillance footage, and finally, the video showing Ethan being abducted. When Margaret finished, the room fell silent. Myers studied the documents and recordings carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she looked up, her expression grim. "This is substantial," she admitted. "If even half of this checks out, we're looking at criminal, conspiracy, corruption, and possibly murder." "But you believe me?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Myers nodded slowly. "I believe you have enough here to warrant a full investigation. But I won't lie to you, this is dangerous territory. People like Hargrove don't play fair. If word gets out that we're onto him, he'll fight back hard. That's why we need to act quickly," Margaret insisted, "before he has time to cover his tracks or silence anyone else." Detective Myers agreed, promising to escalate the matter to higher authorities and involve federal agencies if necessary. As they left the station, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. For once, she wasn't alone in this fight. There were people willing to help her bring Hargrove to justice. News of the investigation spread faster than Margaret anticipated. Within days, reporters began sniffing around, eager to uncover the scandal unfolding in their small town. Local journalists published articles questioning Hargrove's business practices, while national outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on the allegations. Public outrage grew as more details emerged, painting Hargrove not as a respected businessman but as a ruthless predator exploiting his power. Hargrove retaliated fiercely, issuing statements denying all accusations and branding Margaret as a grieving mother blinded by grief. He hired high-profile lawyers and launched smear campaigns, attempting to discredit her and bury the truth. But Margaret refused to back down. Every attack only strengthened her resolve. She gave interviews, spoke at community meetings, and rallied support from those who had suffered under Hargrove's influence. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. One evening, as Margaret watched the news, a breaking report caught her attention. Federal agents had raided Hargrove's estate, seizing documents and computers as part of a corruption probe. Hours later, Hargrove himself was arrested, handcuffed, and led into a waiting car surrounded by flashing cameras. The sight brought tears to Margaret's eyes, not just because justice was finally within reach, but because it meant Ethan hadn't died in vain. Months passed before the trial began, during which Margaret endured sleepless nights and countless court appearances. The prosecution built a solid case, bolstered by the evidence she had uncovered. Witnesses came forward, some reluctantly, others boldly, sharing stories of intimidation, bribery, and worse. Hargrove's empire crumbled under the weight of the allegations, exposing a web of deceit that stretched far beyond the town. In the end, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Hargrove was sentenced to life in prison without parole, his name forever tarnished. As the judge banged the gavel, Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a deep, lingering sadness. No verdict could bring Ethan back, but at least his death had meaning now. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret returned to St. Mary's Church, the same place where her journey had begun. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Friends, family, and strangers filled the pews, united not by grief but by gratitude. They had come to honor Ethan's memory and celebrate the courage of a mother who refused to let the truth stay buried. Standing at the pulpit, Margaret addressed the crowd, her voice strong and clear. "Ethan was more than my son," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He was a fighter, a dreamer, and someone who believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. Today we remember him not for how he died, but for how he lived. And we vow to carry his spirit forward, to stand against injustice, to cherish our loved ones, and to never give up when the odds seem impossible." As she stepped down, the congregation erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the church like a symphony of hope. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the town. For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to smile. The battle had been long and painful, but she had emerged victorious, not just for herself, but for Ethan. His legacy would live on, not as a tragedy, but as a beacon of resilience and truth.